Greetings, I'm Luca Sprues, and today I'll be doing a build and review video of the Italeri 1/72 scale Junkers Ju87 B2/R2 Stuka dive bomber. This kit came out in about 1990, so it's a relatively old mould, but I'm looking forward to building this one. Should be of decent quality. The box contains 2 grey sprues and 1 clear one, along with the decals and some fold-out instructions. The clear parts are very good, with some nice raised canopy frames and good transparency. The rest of the mould has decent engraved surface detail and is almost totally clean of any flash, and the injector pin markings are for the most part hidden quite nicely. I cut off the cockpit parts from the sprue and added the instrument panel, seats, joystick and radio stack to the cockpit floor after neatening the parts up. There are no decals for the cockpit, so you have to paint it. Luckily, the instruments are raised, so it's easy enough to do. There's a moulded gun sight, however the reticle was a solid piece of plastic, so I later cut it off and replaced it with a piece of clear plastic. The cockpit walls unfortunately have no details, so I sanded off the part numbers and I added some ribbing and a circuit breaker panel using some polystyrene sheets, some wiring using some fine gauge metal wiring for flowers or jewellery, and some bits of spare sprue to make stowage, oxygen tanks and parts of the engine controls. I painted the interior a coat of Tamiya XF-22 RLM grey, but I later decided instead to paint it a darker colour because it looked darker in reference photos. So the next 2 layers of paint I used on the inside of the cockpit were instead Tamiya XF-24 dark grey. While the coats of paint dried, I assembled the engine and the propeller. The front radiator and cowling are very nicely moulded, but the part for the back of the radiator is a bit weird, consisting of a raised, meshy frame look on top of a flat piece of plastic, which didn't look very realistic. Fortunately, it is mostly hidden. However, I would recommend replacing it if you're a more serious modeler, with maybe some photo-etched mesh. While the cowling and propeller dried, I completed the wings next, which were very easy to do, especially since the flaps and ailerons were moulded into the lower half of the wing, rather than coming as separate pieces like on other Stuka kits. I thought this was very clever since it made the kit much stronger and easier to build and still looks very realistic. I stuck the propeller between the 2 cowling halves and glued them together, and then moved on to assembling the landing gear before finalising interior details. For the finer details on the interior, I used a fine brush to apply some flat white on some of the wires I added in, as well as flat black on various panels and controls inside the cockpit that I had added. As I mentioned earlier, there were no instrument panel decals, so I had to paint the raised details such as the dials flat black. I used other colours later on. The seats had some moulded seat belts included, which I thought was a very nice touch. I painted them XF-57 buff and then applied some XF-16 flat aluminium to do some chipping on the inside of the cockpit and on the various controls. I added some extra details by using a very fine brush to add Tamiya XF-3 Flat Yellow, X7 Gloss Red, XF-18 Medium Blue, and also a bit of gloss white on things such as the instrument dials, the extra oxygen tank I added, and the engine controls. The final results are here. Unfortunately, I didn't get any video footage because it was a bit difficult. However, I'll try and get some for the next few kits. I joined the 2 fuselage halves, which fitted together excellently, before cutting out and then cleaning up the horizontal stabilizers and their 2 struts. The controls should have fitted flush beside the tail, but for some reason in the kit they were spaced too far away, so I had to slice the mounting point off slightly so they would sit flush. I glued the machine gun covers to the wings before adding the front cowling and the wings to the main fuselage. Once again, the fit was really good on this kit. The landing gear was a bit of a challenge, since they didn't fit very nicely to the wings, so I had to fiddle with them a fair bit to get them to stay in the gap and hold them at the right angle. Eventually, once the glue hardened, the landing gear was strong and stable. However, I did fill the gap a tiny bit with some poly cement. I added a few small parts onto the aircraft, such as the exhausts, and then painted the canopy frames an initial coat of dark grey as a base layer so that the interior colour would appear when looking into the cockpit from the outside. Since the Tamiya paints are water-based, they're relatively easy to scratch off with a piece of sharpened sprue to neaten up any mistakes. Some parts I kept on the sprue, such as the pitot tube and machine gun, and painted them separately while completing the rest of the model to avoid breaking them. I used a sharp hobby knife and some sandpaper to get rid of the seam between the fuselage halves, and then rescored any of the panel lines with the knife, before moving on to painting. I apply a very heavily watered down layer of Tamiya Flat Black all over the model to highlight the recessed panel lines and act as a sort of pre-shading. When the acrylic paints are watered down, they flow more into the recesses of the surfaces, which help add depth and make the details stand out more. This is a very subtle effect once the camouflage is applied, but it's still a very useful technique. The camouflage scheme I chose was the typical Luftwaffe early 3-tone camouflage with some yellow markings. I paint the lightest colour first, so I began by painting the underside with Tamiya light blue XF-23. I make sure to keep my coats very thin by adding a little bit of water so that the paint flows nice and evenly and is slightly transparent, but not to the point where it's only flowing into the gaps and the recesses of the model surface. I also try to apply the paint in one direction, usually in the direction of the airflow of the aircraft if it was flying. By doing this, it helps keep the layers uniform, avoiding brush strokes showing through. I continue this technique with 2 coats of RLM 71 from AK Interactive's 3rd generation range on the top. I also use a very fine brush to apply 2 layers of RLM 71 onto the canopy frames. I've recently started using AK Interactive 3rd generation paints since they are better in terms of quality and accuracy for Luftwaffe colours. To create the splintering pattern, I outline the lines carefully using RLM 70, and then I fill in the shapes, carefully following the paint guide. Again, I keep the coats relatively thin and try to apply them as much as possible in the same direction to avoid paint streaks. I repeat this process for each camouflage layer, taking it slow to get the shapes accurate. I apply overall 3 layers of light blue on the underside, 2 layers of RLM 71 before adding a layer of RLM 70, and then following up with a layer of RLM 71 to clean up the camouflage pattern, and then adding once again a coat of the darker RLM 70. I didn't glue the canopy to the fuselage so that I could paint the machine gun separate, but I temporarily stick it onto the fuselage and paint the extra layer of RLM 70 to complete the camouflage pattern on the frames with the very fine brush. After adding the final layer of the darker RLM 70 onto the camouflage pattern, I apply Tamiya XF-3 Flat Yellow onto the front cowlings and on the rudder fin based on the markings for the aircraft I'm doing. After painting 3 coats of flat yellow, I paint the wheels flat black in 2 layers. After painting the wheels, I then finish painting the small parts I left on the sprue and then gluing them in place. These include the machine gun and the VHF antenna that goes on top of the canopy. I use a sharpened cocktail stick to scratch off any mistakes on the canopy before gluing it onto the fuselage and painting up the gap where they join to neaten it up. Next come the decals. I applied them by soaking them in some warm water before resting them on some paper towel to absorb the excess, and then wetting the area I intend to apply them slightly with a brush, and slide them on with my fingers and a brush. I then dab away any excess water with a paper towel to help them conform to the model. Overall, the decals for this kit are very comprehensive and are of a very good quality in terms of detail and durability. I also noticed barely any silvering, even without applying a gloss coat, to mitigate this. Once the decals are applied, I dab some Tamiya decal adhesive to them to help them stick and conform to the model surface. It also helps with detail since it shows the recesses better through the decals. I then paint a final coat of flat black on the wheels before setting the model aside for 24 hours to dry. After leaving the model, I paint the exhaust Tamiya X-31 titanium gold before moving on to the weathering process. I begin by adding metal chipping onto the surfaces that would be likely exposed to it, by using a very fine brush to apply some Tamiya flat aluminium. I focus on the recesses for various access hatches and along the cowlings where maintenance crews would likely scratch the surface, as well as on the wings and the control surfaces which would be exposed to debris while in flight, and also on the propeller and the hub. It's relatively easy to find sources online that show where weathering is most likely to occur, so I recommend taking a look at photos when doing it. The next step was to add some grimes and streaking. I do this by applying some watered down flat black onto the access hatches for fuel and oil, and then with a fine brush and a sponge drag it in the direction of the airflow to create a streaking effect. I also repeat this process on the control surfaces. I use a larger brush to apply some flat black over the exhausts, and also use it to create some exhaust stains by streaking it back over the area where the exhausts would go on the aircraft. I also use the sponge to help do this. Finally, I add a slightly burnt effect by using a bit of flat white behind the exhaust streaks, and I use a bit of flat earth on the underside of the wheels and the struts to create some dirt effect. And with that, the model is finally completed. So, in short, this is a very good little kit. Nice details, a little bit lackluster on the interior, especially compared to the Airfix Stuka, which has a lot better detail. Otherwise though, this is a pretty good kit. It's relatively cheap too. It's almost half the price of the Airfix Stuka in most places, so that's a pretty good deal, I'd say. If you like the look of this kit, come down to TechtonicHobbies. We've got a fairly large range of Italeri and Airfix in stock, and we can pretty much order whatever you want in. So yeah, grab yourself a Stuka and have a go. Thank you so much guys for watching this video. A special shout out to our wonderful patrons, Joan, Archie Palmer, Emo and J&K Jones. Your contributions have been absolutely amazing this last year, so thank you so much guys. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to TechtonicHobbies for supporting this video. It's great to have a local hobby store in the area, so go check them out if you're around, 447 Wisest Road. Thank you very much again for watching, and model on!